Good evening. We want to welcome you to Scarritt Bennett Center for this evening's conversation. I am Reverend Dr. Donna Patterson, the Anamkara Chaplain in Residence here at Scarritt Bennett, and we welcome you whether you're here virtually or in person for the stimulating conversation that will be had. And it will be led by Dr. Amy Wright, who is Professor of Creative Writing at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville. And she's the author of 4 books. The latest one is beside her there, Paper Concerts, A Conversation in the Round. Dr. Wright will be guiding this conversation and introducing Dr. López on asserting agency and empowerment of women. So thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you all so much for being here. It is an honor to talk tonight with Dr. López, Research Professor of English and the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair Emerita. For 20 years, Dr. López has given her time, energy, and wisdom to the Vanderbilt community, and I would like to celebrate the fact that 1 month into her retirement, she continues to share her insights now. Her commitment to educating readers and empowering writers is deep. Lorraine López has written 7 works of fiction and edited or co-edited 3 essay collections. Her first book, Soy la Avon Lady and Other Stories, won the inaugural Miguel Marmol Prize for Fiction, and her first novel, Call Me Henri, was awarded the Patterson Prize for Young Adult Literature. Her essay collection, An Angle of Vision, introduced me to her work, and I would like to read 2 quotes from it that set the stage for today's talk on agency. The first quote is from Dorothy Allison, one of the contributors to this anthology, and Dorothy says, "I took it as a given that a woman like me would have to do it the hard way. Steal time away from my day job, work without an editor or ready reader, and never have any confidence that what I was writing would be anything that anyone would want to read. But I never imagined not writing." Of course, that was inspiring to me, as was this line and this story, because I felt a deep kinship with it. And this is from Lorraine López's essay included in this anthology, Our Mother's Lie. "I spend a lot of time watching others, being silent and circumspect, concentrating my attention on not slipping up or not being detected for what I am, not betraying where I am from. I think I'm good at this, but sometimes I make mistakes. Like the time I balanced a wine glass on a coaster at a faculty get-together and a senior faculty member laughed outright. 'You don't need a coaster with stemware,' he said. My face felt on fire, and I don't remember anything else from that evening." These voices, along with other women writers contained in the anthology, Women Writers on Their Poor and Working Class Roots, provide models for overcoming challenges to express ourselves. They open their life stories and share challenges they had to overcome to be heard. Inspired by their courage and vulnerability, I reached out to Dorothy Allison to talk more about her relationship to class. Excerpts from that interview are contained in my new release, Paper Concert, and tonight I hope to extend the dialogue in both books by talking about how to open channels of access for ourselves and others. And I do hope tonight is a dialogue. There will be plenty of time for your questions in person and virtually after our readings. I'll open with a question that I posed to Dorothy from the book. What defines class? Dorothy says, "It's always an argument, because class is defined in opposition and to some extent in denial. Especially in American society, there's a lot of shame and refusal. To a large extent, we have the delusion that we are a classless nation, and that's just a frank, outright lie. The essential onus on the working class is to be always inappropriate and embattled. You're always in an argument with the overclass about who and what you are, particularly in the South, but also in other regions. They have complicated gradations of class in California, yet we have very simple-minded ways we think about socioeconomics in this country. We think in terms of the broad categories of working class, middle class, upper class, but if you ask someone to define herself, it always gets more nuanced. My sisters, for instance, never wanted anyone to know that we were poor, so there was a refusal to discuss our position in the class structure. If someone did try to talk about it, my sister Barbara would say, "Well, we're really middle class." Our stepfather always had a job, our mama always worked, but the working poor is still a phenomenon. And I define the working poor as people who can't eat every night. I know it sounds petty and trivial, but the struggle was to go to school 5 days in a row without having to wear the same outfit 3 times. Kids are ruthless. They notice all those details. All of the earmarks of being raised poor were there, but we pretended with the rest of America that we were part of the great middle. It's very hard to change something you can't acknowledge. And then I followed up and asked her, why distinguish between middle and working class when the top 10% of America's wealthiest families hold 85% of the nation's wealth? Of course, it's more dramatic. The percentage is more dramatic now. And she says, I often conflate the upper and middle class, although they aren't the same. It's just that we have almost no access to the upper class, so we really can't impact them in any immediately recognizable way. But we can impact the middle class, sometimes, through literature. I deeply believe that the best American literature is working class literature, and part of it is the perspective of working class escapees. And I use the term escapees advisedly. I don't think you genuinely leave your class of origin, but like the discovery that you're queer, and a bit like the discovery that you're smart, it divides you. It separates you out. Name the works of genius by American artists, and you'll find that working class artists created them because they had nothing to lose. The choice is life or death. You will be either murdered outside the Greyhound bus station in your hometown, or you'll go to New York to become a dancer or a singer or a poet or a writer of fiction. And you find that over and over again. When you find great artists and you query them, you find that they come from a small town and they're estranged from their family. You know why. Even if they weren't queer, they're queer in that broader context of being unacceptable. So I'm sure you can hear the liveliness and the generosity of Dorothy's voice in there. And so she was ultimately what brought me to Dr. López because she's contained in the anthology. And so I reached out to Dr. López because I wanted to extend this conversation. And so maybe now we can hear from your angle of vision.
Yes. When you invited me to take part in this conversation, which thank you very much for doing that, I thought that I would read part of the introduction. But then I realized, oh my God, it's so dated. Just as the statistics that you provided need to be updated, the introduction needs to be updated. So I had to pull from the personal essay aspects, the things that are not so incorrect right now. But still, it starts in the past, and I'll go ahead and share that. This is from the introduction, adapted from the introduction. Summer 2007, Friday night. My husband's toll-free business line rings and rings. He's out of town, and I avoid answering it. I'm a bad message taker, deliberately unfit to work as a personal assistant. Besides, I'm putting my granddaughter to bed, reading books to her. When the phone begins its third series of rings, I race to his office and lift the receiver. It's my daughter, calling from an emergency room. She tells me her husband has been in a car accident, injured and then arrested for driving with an invalid license due to missed child support payments for children he's fathered in other relationships. The police have released him for medical treatment. His arrest stands, and he'll soon have to appear in court. My daughter tells me of the migraine knocking in her skull. She describes her toddler staggering around the waiting room, giddy with exhaustion, and she mentions that she has to be at work at McDonald's by 4 a.m. What should I do, Mama? She says. Even with the phone cradled to my ear, I can hear music and laughter spilling from a house near ours. In this cul-de-sac of oversized hilly lots, sound carries strangely well. Neighbors across the street are moving to an even bigger house. This is their farewell party. At the last minute, I was invited to go, but I declined. How hard it must be, I tell my daughter. You deal with a lot. She lives with an aunt of her husband's just outside of Atlanta in a house crowded with various family members who are likewise adrift without permanent addresses. Conflict defines a household. Squabbles, arguments, and sometimes physical fights break out. This is why our granddaughter's staying with us for the summer. Before moving in with this aunt, my daughter and her family rented an apartment where their gas was shut off. They spent the entire winter without hot water before being evicted in early spring. I made payments to keep the electricity connected, but it's foolish to send them money directly. My son-in-law, who's unemployed, spends whatever comes his way on beer, cigarettes, and tricking out his 4x4 truck. Instead, I buy clothes for the children, send grocery store gift certificates, and pay for childcare. There's no way I can convince my daughter of what I think she should do, just as no one could tell me anything when I was in my 20s with children, working 60 hours a week to pay rent and put food on the table, and dealing with an abusive spouse. No one can tell a woman who is poor and played out how to make better choices, how to take control of her life. Ideas for how to gain the authority to make provident decisions often evade us when we are yoked to minimum wage jobs, freighted with children, and locked into damaging relationships. Authority is power that comes of esteem, earned through character, skillfulness, acumen, and above all, confidence. No one can give this to anyone. Each person must earn and claim it on her own. In my case, I have had the great good fortune in finding wise guides to direct me toward agency, toward authority. Joy Harjo, Sandra Cisneros, Judith Ortiz-Cofer, and especially Dorothy Allison shared stories and poems that provided the roadmap to authority for me. I read of their experiences, and at the same time, as I recognized myself in their pages, I was transformed. Of course, this is what art does. It engenders recognition and change. Literature changed me from object to subject in the long, convoluted sentence that is my life. Most importantly, I read writing by women like me who read stories and poems and essays that profoundly altered their lives so that they were provoked to join the conversation. As Dorothy Allison puts it, quote, "Literature is a conversation, a lively, enthralling exchange that continually challenges and widens our imaginations," end quote. A writer is an author in the literal sense while also claiming authority over her own life. Even so, leaving poverty and powerlessness behind is no easy thing. Many never have the opportunity to attempt it, and few succeed. As Allison observes, quote, "The inescapable impact of being born into a condition of poverty that this society finds shameful, contemptible, and somehow oddly deserved has had dominion over us to such an extent that we have spent our lives trying to overcome or deny it," end quote. Changing this condition would have been unimaginable for me without the women writers who gifted me with astute and generous instruction. Since I can't tell anyone how to gain empowerment or attain agency, I can instead share how I work my way toward the place where I decide what I do and how I live, where I author narratives on the page and in my life in which I determine what happens. Though challenged with hardships, many of my own making, I was lucky in having a dream and finding examples to show me the way toward it. Both proved critical. Desire catalyzed my trajectory, and the literature I read sustained it. Even as a child, growing up in a working-class Mexican-American family, I knew that I longed to create stories, and from an early age, I determined to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. A capable but indifferent reader at first, I once had a teacher tell me that good writers are great readers, so I began spending recess and lunchtime in the school library, reading book after book. I worked in libraries from elementary school through college, so I could be near them to plan what to read next. Another teacher mentioned that the best writers are interested in people, and presto, I became a dedicated snoop, eavesdropping and poking around in other people's business in a relentless way. If becoming a writer required me to stand on my head for several hours each day, the top of my skull would be flat by now. I was too single-minded, too focused, and too oblivious throughout my childhood to see that people like me didn't often become writers. That was a blessing too. When the unlikelihood of realizing my dream finally occurred to me, my wise guides took over. Some of these women had come from backgrounds more challenging than mine, and they marched right past obstacles, overcoming self-doubt and skepticism of others to arrive exactly where I wanted to be. Their books were proof to me that this could be done. My daughter too had a dream, a longing for agency and authority, and though it took her some time, she found a way to attain it. In the years since the introduction to An Angle of Vision was compiled, she took her children and left her husband and his truck. They moved in with my husband and me, and she finished the undergraduate degree she started before marrying. In the 12 years since the collection was published, she's earned a law degree. She's now an attorney, and her younger child, the toddler, staggering around the ER waiting room, has just started his first semester of college. Back to that summer night, over 15 years ago, while I'm on the phone with my daughter, another burst of hilarity explodes from the neighbor's house. My daughter asks me again what she should do. I suggest she call in sick. She says no, they need the money. Her voice is firm and quiet, a stark contrast to the merriment in the background. I can't help thinking, there's a party going on here, people celebrating good fortune all over this country. When our phone call ends, I return to my granddaughter and our books. Some of the same I read to my daughter when she was a child, not understanding then, as I do now, that this practice provides a look at other lives, other choices. It stimulates the habit of projecting the self into different and better circumstances. It can offer a glimpse of the celebration itself, the party, to which we must ultimately write our own invitations.
That is beautiful. I would like to insert it into every copy of the book. It's such a gift to give that update and the full story of that introduction.
Well, thank you. I really wanted to update the statistics that were in the introduction because they are worse now.
Right.
But I did not have the time. I was on a deadline to get another work done.
Well, and we also have quite enough to deal with the pandemic on top of the statistics. We would hope that it would have improved, but yeah, the conversation clearly needs to still be had. Definitely important. So I have some questions, but first I have to note that it's interesting, your comment about projection of the self being what reading teaches you. I think it's central to the conversation in this book because I was thinking of the self. I start in the introduction asking, what is the self? I didn't know, and it was something that I felt really embarrassed about because I thought everyone else knew what the self was and only I didn't know what the self was. But my self kept shifting and changing, and I kept going to books and seeing what is their self? What is their self? And so ultimately, the book is just a series of questions where I'm trying to find my way to what comprises me, and I kind of learned the lesson that the self is social, that we are ultimately comprised of our conditioning and what we learn and inhabit as readers, and so it all kind of comes into play as we keep asking and questioning that, if we're open to it. I think I lost my mic for a minute. So the first question is, why were you motivated to compose this anthology? Because it's very vulnerable, and I would say a tremendous risk to have put something out talking about class at all. But why about women writers in particular were you moved to gather this anthology?
It started with, I guess I'll go back maybe a bit. I think it was about being at Vanderbilt. This was when I first came to Vanderbilt, and this is when class distinctions were very pronounced for me. I could see very clearly how I was and was not part of this community. I was different from my colleagues, and not just because I was a fiction writer. I think they were glad that this is when the English department here is very welcoming of creative writers, which is not always the case. But I could see that there were things that my colleagues, the resources my colleagues had, things that my colleagues knew that I did not know. And so I became, as you mentioned in that quote, I'm so happy you quoted that, I became very watchful and became very imitative. So, but it just struck me that I couldn't be an integrated self. There was the Vanderbilt self who is on high alert and trying to be observant and to blend in. And then there was the writer self who was more integrated. So it was just, it came out of the discomfort. And then I thought, well, I wonder if other people feel this way. So I thought the AWP conference was coming up, and I loved AWP conferences to go. And it's like, this is your writing life. You meet so many people that you've been maybe in classes with, or you've been working with on some project, and it's just a wonderful experience. So I just thought I would ask people I knew if they wanted to be part of this panel. And I happen to be friends with, as Dorothy Ellison observes, a lot of writers come from lower class backgrounds. So it was easy for me to find people to be on that panel. We gave the panel at, I think it was AWP in Georgia, and Leanne Fields, who was the editor from University of Michigan Press, came up to us after. There were a couple of people who came up to us and said, would you like to do a book? I thought, I really respected the poetry series out of University of Michigan, so that was the one that I thought, yes, this is where I'd like to be. I like the books out of Michigan. So then I just decided I would invite people to be part of it. And it was, as you mentioned, it was a very uncomfortable thing. I would ask people and they would say, but I'm not working class. My family was not, like Dorothy's sister, they were in denial about it.
Right.
So initially we called the collection Trashy Women, and that I love that title, but that was really problematic for one of the contributors who said that she could not be in it if it was, and she had such a great piece, and I had to be sensitive to her, her feeling about it. So we went with the title of an essay that I really admire in there, by Joy Castro. So that's where it started. It started with uncomfortableness, and it was great to find out that other people felt uncomfortable too.
I got to invite Dorothy to Austin Peay to serve as our ACEF Chair of Excellence through the Center of Excellence for the Creative Arts in 2016 and 17. And one of the best gifts that she gave to our students, because we do have many non-traditional students at Austin Peay, and we also have many first-generation college students. And one of the best gifts is she understood that watchfulness and wariness of trying to know how to behave in college, because you didn't have models. A lot of our students don't have models for that. And so she understood, and she said she knew how to reach out to them. She knew how to look for the kind of shifty eyes and the hesitation and not being the first out there with comments. And she would reach out to those students and she would ask them questions. She would invite them into the conversation. She gave them access. And she was also a great mentor for me because I understood better how to reach out to the students who are more reticent. It's not always because of shyness. A lot of times it's because they don't know how to behave and they're watching others to learn how to do that. So I was wondering, you gave the panel talk with Dorothy, but what was the original connection to Dorothy? How did you first get to know her?
I don't think she was on that panel.
Oh, okay.
But I met Dorothy at Macondo. Well, actually, I was in the audience, so I can't say I met her. I was in the audience when she read at Berry College one time. She gave a knockout reading at Berry College, and I'm getting a little chills right now just remembering it because she was just so passionate and so, it was a transformative experience. She was just amazing, and I wanted to include her in this. So I would go to Macondo workshops in San Antonio. These are workshops, writing workshops established by Sandra Cisneros, that are open to anybody who writes and does social activism. So Dorothy was one of the workshop leaders. I wasn't in her workshop, but she gave a reading, and I had a chance to talk to her after that. And when the workshops were over, we all traded information, I think mailing addresses, and I had her email. But I thought, I'm going to write a letter. I'm going to write her a handwritten letter. And I wrote her a letter explaining the project by hand, and I told her how much I was moved by her reading at Berry College and her presentation at Macondo. And she emailed me back, wanted to be part of it. Oh. She's just an incredibly generous person, and just someone who has had such an impact on my life and on so many people's lives that it's astonishing.
Right. No, it is. It's a true inspiration. And Berry College was doing the Southern Women Writers Conference, and they stopped doing that. I got one of the last years. I got to attend it for just a year.
That's sad, because that was a great event.
I mean, they may have picked it back up, but I know that was the last one for some number of years. Would you give the favorite example from the book? I know Dorothy's got plenty of examples, but you want to call in one of the other writers from it?
Yes, Dorothy's pieces stand out. It's just great. The titular piece by Joy Castro, that is a very, very strong piece. She's just an incredibly beautiful writer. Technically speaking, she's brilliant with this. On the level of sentence, she as one writer as a writer reading another writer, she really encourages me to step up my game and work on my sentences. She's just a beautiful writer, and what she writes is so powerful and moving, and the experiences that she relays. When I write in here, there are people who've come from backgrounds more challenging than mine. That's Joy Castro. She's just remarkable. I would encourage everyone to please read Joy Castro. You will be very glad that you did.
When this anthology, we've started this conversation, but when it was published, you hoped to conduct a long overdue discussion on class, gender, and writing. And of course, it continues to be overdue. But how have you seen that discussion evolve and change in the years since?
Yes, I think it's kind of, I'm not going to say gotten pushed to the side, but I think there are other large concerns that are in the forefront of our national discourse. For example, when the Me Too movement gained a lot of attention, I thought that was very important, and that was a conversation that needed to be had, and the police brutality is another conversation. Police brutality and race are conversations that we need to have that are critical and important. So I think the conversation is expanding, and it's a conversation that is about injustice. And it is a good thing that it's expanding. I don't like to think that social class is getting ignored, but it's an implicit thing that doesn't get the attention that it could get. And now it's getting very tricky because lower class now, the associations with lower class are becoming very curious. When we see, for example, with the recall election, Gavin Newsom in California, how many people who identify as lower class were gravitating toward recalling him and going for conservative, and how many people are going toward political interests that don't serve them well. Right. So it is a more complicated conversation. It's a more the stakes are higher, I think, for the conversation, and it is becoming more and more difficult to talk about social class, because it's, as Dorothy astutely observed at the time when you interviewed her, it is not just one thing. It is nuanced. It's complicated. People have divided feelings about that.
And it's also interesting because the year after, I looked it up because I wasn't sure what year it was, but Brene Brown gave her talk about strength and vulnerability at the TED Talk, and I thought, but vulnerability is still risky, putting yourself out there and exposing yourself. So just because, she gave that one talk, it doesn't make it easy. And all of those conversations are deeply vulnerable. And they're all the Me Too, the Black Lives Matter, those mean going out there, sometimes risking your lives. I mean, Dorothy talks about, later in the interview, she talks about having her life risked as part of, standing up for the women's movement. And so the only answer really is collective voices coming together and continuing to, express those stories and to speak out. I think that's the only answer. But it speaks to this quote from An Angle of Vision. You say, quote, "No one can give another authority," and you nicely read that in your introduction, thank you. "It must be earned and it must be claimed." And so why is it important for women writers in particular to claim that authority?
Oh, I think it's critical, because if we don't claim that authority, someone else will claim it for us, and someone else will tell a story that will be construed as our story. And I'm thinking of people, especially, for example, Latino authors have a very low representation in publishing, and they have very limited big industry publications, and because there is 3% of the publishing industry is Hispanic. That's wacky when you think of 18% of the country is Latinx. There's no way that addresses that. So when someone writes a book who is maybe a sympathetic apologist perspective from a Latinx perspective and tells that story, it is infuriating, because that story is being appropriated and told incorrectly or inauthentically by someone else. And that's the danger there. If you don't tell your story, then someone may tell a story and call it your story. And that's when you get statements like, "I wanted to create a face out of the faceless masses." It is just so inappropriate and so wrong to think that you're going to create an identity for someone who is not you at all. And I know, yes, we're creative writers. We should be able to write about Martians and in sympathetic way, but I don't think we should tell stories that don't belong to us and then claim them as this now this is their story.
Right.
That's just really problematic.
Right, and we need those stories, and the same, going back to the projection of the self and reading and expanding our sense of, possibility for the whole human experience. We need those stories to be written from within.
Right, we do. We really, really do. But we need support. We need support in publishing to get those stories out there. So.
And I say authority and agency are important rights for all human beings, not just writers, since the stories we tell ourselves shape our thoughts and lives. What might you say to those who do not feel licensed to create or revise their stories?
Well, again, then you're going to confront that risk of having someone else, being misrepresented and being misunderstood. So I think that risk outweighs the fear of not having the license to do that. I realize that not everyone can write stories. I realize that I can't sing. I'll never be able to sing. So I accept that. But if we take writing a story as a metaphor for expressing the self in an aesthetic way, I take the question to mean, what about people who want to do this but don't feel permission to do this? I would really say to these people to work on getting that permission. And think about, what is the worst thing that can happen? You'll write a book and nobody will read it. So what? That's the nature of the world. You write. What does Luis Rodriguez say? If you want to keep a secret, put it in a book. Nobody's going to read it. So, big deal. I think that is to lose sight of what the joy of creating is, and that is in the writing of the story. What happens afterwards, that's not your business. So,
and that greater risk that you don't tell your story, that you don't get to express it.
It is unfathomable. Why wouldn't you do that? My grandmother, who spoke very little English, I thought she was shy, but then I hear stories where she was not shy, but she wasn't comfortable in English. And she didn't work, which was unfathomable to me too, because my mother worked. I didn't understand, what do you do? So I would tell her, well, why don't you write a book? Here you are, and I was a child, because that's what I wanted to do. You should be writing a book, Grandma. And she would just laugh like it was a joke. But, so I couldn't really understand. She had all this time, and she didn't write a book. She also, because her husband worked on the railroad, had a lifetime railroad pass and never went anywhere. And I'm just like, what is going on, Grandma? You're driving me crazy. Get on a train and write a book right away. And she wouldn't do those things. So yeah, so I don't know that she really wanted to write a book, and maybe she found other ways to express herself. But I really struggled to understand, well, why aren't you doing that?
I think a lot of times it's about giving self permission. I mean, sometimes we're licensed by others that they help us, and sometimes it's a process of maturity. But I wonder if you can pinpoint a moment where you felt that you needed or could claim your authority, just so we know what that looks like.
Yeah, I'm glad that you put it like that, because it is not a static condition, having authority. There are moments where the bottom drops out and you have no authority whatsoever. I mean, but yeah, I think that the moments where I feel, okay, I'm so glad that I did that. Good girl, Lorraine. I'm proud of you. Would be times where I have said to, in a friendship or a relationship, this is not what I want. We can't go on this way. And just to be, and for me that is a very hard thing to do, because we're so inculcated in the cult of niceness. So it's very hard to say, no, I can't. This is not what I want. This is not good for us. We need to stop. So those are the moments where I feel, I know it sounds bad, but these are the moments where I feel like I can only go so far, and then that's it. We can't. And I try to be respectful about it. Also, I'm retired, and so retiring was really hard.
Sure.
Because I think I told you, I felt like I was at Vanderbilt. I felt like I was in a relationship with somebody way out of my league, and so I thought that. To others, it might seem, oh, she's insane. She's. So that was very empowering, though, for me to say, okay, I remember what I'm here for. I remember what I wanted, and that was to be a writer. It's very seductive to get into the careerism of the university, but I had to remember this is not what it was about. It's about becoming a writer. So that was a moment where I felt that I claimed authority.
You can tell that, it comes from a place internally, that almost a deep grounding, and then making the decisions And in a lot of ways, I'm not sure that women are conditioned in the same way to be decisive. Even the word, assertive, can have negative connotations for women. Did crafting fictions help you to craft and shape this sense of ownership and licensing of your story?
I think it's kind of writing stories is kind of an epistemology for me. It's a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding the world. I can't. It has to be in narrative shape, or I won't really remember it, or understand it, or care about it. So that just is something I've always done, even as a child. If there has to be a story there, and that will help me to understand it and deal with it. It is a way to organize and order things and exert control over them to a certain extent. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a way of seeing the world and a way of ordering and controlling. One of my sisters is a social worker who works with, she's retired too. She paved the way for me. She worked with traumatized children, and one of her observations is that when the children can begin to talk about their experiences, narrate them, then they're beginning to heal and take control over what happened to them and organize it. So yes, storytelling is very much about taking authority. It's also about playing. It's a way to play all day long with these characters that you do things with, and you work out problems with them in interesting ways. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. It's also, I think even when you're playing with literal dolls, as a kid, you're sort of enacting the stories, and to some extent it's things that you would like to see and sometimes don't see depicted. One of the things that Dorothy talked about is working class heroines. We don't have many of those. And so she wrote them. And so to some extent we create them in order to see them, and then once you see them, you can maybe live that. So I think they're all connected.
Yes, because when you have a protagonist, by definition, that is a person with agency. That's a person with capacity for choice and change. So you see that character as someone you can recognize, and you see that person exert choice and exert change, you're experiencing recognition and transformation at the same time. And that's really, really a powerful thing.
That's beautiful. I think that's actually a perfect segue to open it to conversations, either from in person or virtual. If we have any of those, I have some more questions myself, but I'd like to extend the opportunity and the invitation to others if you have that.
I have a question. I'm not mic'd, so you might have to repeat it for the online audience, but I'm curious, thank you for this conversation, and I've particularly appreciated I've heard you both use the phrase permission to. Permission to share my story, permission. And I'm curious, as someone who grew up very poor, I have struggled with permission toward pleasure. And I mean that in a broad sense, right? Like permission for pleasure for something that, for its own sake, there's no utility to it, there's no use, and that whole feeling of, especially as I came out of poverty, that feeling of permission to enjoy something for its own sake without feeling guilty like I'm wasteful. That this money could go toward this instead, or that this energy or this effort, this time. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the role of pleasure in claiming your own story, claiming your own agency, that kind of thing.
That's a great question.
Well, do you want to, or?
We can, but I have some things to say, but you can start.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think you're touching upon this conditioning that we undergo from a very young age, where everything costs something, and you can't really enjoy it because you have to pay for it, and if it costs too much, you can't have it. And sad to say, I don't think you ever. If I use myself as an example, I don't know that ever goes away entirely. it does interfere with enjoyment of things. It really does. But to this day, when I go to a restaurant, I'll immediately look for what's the least expensive thing I can order. What is the, I don't deserve more than that. I don't want it, even though I can clearly afford it. I can afford more now. But it's just this conditioning that is pervasive and relentless and very hard to break free from. So I think it's important to try to I think you're being aware of it is huge, is really huge. And I think from there, just to catch yourself at those moments and flip the switch, do something differently, and don't let that colonize you more than it has already. I don't know if that helps. I haven't been very successful at that, but I'm working on it too.
I'll speak from a long inheritance. My grandparents were farmers, and I think that definitely influenced my education. But I feel about writing that it needs to be useful. Because just writing for pleasure, and I still write poems, and I still take that time, whole stretches of mornings, whole stretches of weekends and things like that. But it's always, I've convinced myself to do that because I make it a practical art. In the same way that paper concert, if you listen to the questions through there, I'm working things out, and it's an offering to the reader of knowledge, insights gathered from over 50 different contributors. And so it feels like an offering and a gesture, and that counters that impulse against waste, against frivolity, against luxury. So yeah, you might have to trick yourself a little bit and justify the pleasure on some other level.
Transcribe and read it back to them to be sure it's what they really want to say. Are there opportunities for that?
I think there's software for that you can speak into the microphone, and it will transcribe what you've written, what you've spoken into writing, and you can work on it from there if that's what you're interested in doing. But also, I don't know that the writing has to be there, because we have so many opportunities to do things online, to create a video of yourself speaking, saying what you want to say, and posting that. And I think you probably get a lot more in terms of audience.
And I think I was thinking more of women who don't have that skill, that knowledge for how to use the technology, but if they could talk to someone who could listen, give them feedback, tell me more, that sort of one-on-one was more what I had in mind about helping women who either feel inadequate or shy, or a sense of not being skilled for whatever reason, or unable to express themselves.
That is exactly the dynamic that you want to go for, where you're in conversation with somebody, and that will help ask questions and pull those stories from you. I wish there were ready-made groups that do that, but I will tell you that the Porch here in Nashville does have classes and workshops that puts a variety of community writers in conversation with each other. And so you can, start those conversations there, express that interest there, because there are all kinds of young writers who are hungry for stories, who are looking for research, and that you can make connections in that way. So that's where I would go first, since Nashville already has that community. Mm-hmm.
I think I would take it to a different level in giving voice to women who don't feel that they have that agency. My story is not important. And how do you encourage others to do that? And as a second part of a question, we have so much social media and so much just TV and so many, people don't, or young people, well, not even just young people, don't read anymore. How do you encourage not only telling the story, but both of you have been influenced by other writers? And how do we get across the importance of reading and hearing these stories? They may not be very different than our own, but it does help us to formulate and find self and voice.
I'll let you start. I think I've got a text from a virtual question.
I think we're still telling stories, but I think the way that we're telling stories is changing, is evolving, and we're going away from print media. I don't think it will completely vanish, but I do see this narratives migrating to film and to other performed modes rather than the book. I don't think the book will go away. I think that there are plenty of people still interested in reading and writing. But to go back to your other question about voice, and if I'm right, you're asking how can we encourage people to have their voice and understand that their voice is important. I think that links to a little bit to my introduction. It's not something we can give people. I would suspect, though, if someone is asking, about that there is an incipient interest, there is a spark they need to kindle in them, so that they can get that confidence to write. Because the world of writing is not a very welcoming world at all. So I think of Flannery O'Connor's quote when she was asked, don't writing programs discourage young writers? And she said, not enough of them. And so it is, it's cruel, but it is rather true. There is nothing in the world of writing that's going to be nurturing of your voice. You really need to find that within yourself or within a community of writers, because it is not for the faint of heart. It is not. I used to save all my rejections, and then they became too many to store. So I don't know.
I would say that don't discredit that need for community and that need for affirmation to be reflected back, because it happens all the way at the highest levels. When Margaret Rinkle read from her first book at Parnassus, she talked about, now she's on her second book, she's publishing in the New York Times, and she talked about the importance of her local creative writing community to help her feel like she was justified in giving voice to her stories. And so just because somebody has books out, it doesn't mean that they didn't do it with a community. There's a reason why the acknowledgments in the backs of books are so long. Nobody does it alone. Nobody does it alone. I mean, I dreamt of Emily Dickinson as a young poet. It's gone. That day is gone. Nobody goes it alone. So there's a really great question. It says, I'm interested from the online community. I'm interested in the ways a person born working class or poor might break the strictures of penury and watchfulness that you've talked about. Do you think that a person can overcome shame, for example, or is it with you always? So I'll let you think about that.
Yeah, I think you can, I really believe you can turn, and this was part of the impetus for this project, you can turn something that is a deficit into a benefit. yes, I came from a lower class background. Yes, we never owned a home. We were always renting. We were always nervous about the landlord. Yes, all those things. But I claim that. I think that's important to acknowledge. I don't feel ashamed of it. I feel I'm kind of proud of it. And I sometimes notice, though, that people who don't have that background sometimes feel a little bit ashamed. But yeah, I think they're. I don't think I would have written that book if I were so impeded by shame. It was a definite catalyst. It definitely triggered the project, being at Vanderbilt and feeling less than. But it was also something that I felt kind of proud. I do feel proud about right now. How about you? What was your experience?
Dorothy says it so well in here. I asked her at some point, she talks about contempt really serving her, and so I asked her how, and she said, well, if it doesn't kill you, essentially it did harden that sense of self, and so she looked at that as like a source of strength. Ultimately, all that she had gone through, and she turned it into, exactly as you said, an asset rather than a deficit. And she also said on the counter to it, she said, rich girls, she was in New York, and she's, this ardent lesbian feminist, and she was like, they were beautiful, but just so ineffectual, And so you can just see her, oh, you all can't do anything, but look nice. Here I can, change a tire if need be, and so she had turned that into, a real source of like confidence, which I found beautiful.
But and also I think the other side is that there's still moments of shame, and not knowing how to behave quite, and feeling out of place in certain environments. When I went for to the Penn Faulkner, the gala or whatever, and these incredibly wealthy donors are at tables, and you're placed as the author at a table, and I could not relate. I could not relate.
Sure.
So I kept my mouth shut, and I ate my meal.
Yeah, she talks about the pain of it too. It doesn't go away. It's not, but it does make her more compassionate for those other ones. The question: have you ever attempted? Oh, this is a good one. Have you ever attempted to pass as a member of a different socioeconomic class?
Oh yeah, big time, always. I mean, whenever I feel that I'm about to be disrespected, I bring my English professor voice out, and I speak very crisply. I enunciate. I stand up straight. I don't want to be treated as less than. And in a certain context, I fear that I will be.
One more question: how can poor people be more rich and rich people be more poor? Well, if we knew that, we'd be out, changing the game, I think.
Well, I happen to think that poor people are, I'm sorry about that. Poor people are rich in certain ways I think that if you are marginalized, you're by definition in the margin. So you can see things that people who are in the center stage can't see. So I think that is a real value. You have that strength, you have that richness. That richness is a vantage point, that you can see things that other people can't see. And you can also take that and become a more compassionate person with that information. And you can transfer what you see and the inequity that you observe that goes unnoticed. Privilege blinds people. It goes unnoticed by others. You can use that and apply it to other people who may not be marginalized for the reasons you're marginalized, but you can empathize and understand. So I think you can become rich if you're poor in empathic imagination and in your viewpoint. in your experiences, what you see, how you mature. I think that if you're working class and you grow up like I did, you probably had to have a job when you were 14 years old. And that is very, now that I see my grandson who's in college has never had a job, I think you should have a job. That's really build your character. He's got a good character, a really good character, but I think it would also be a nice socializing thing as well. It helps you become socialized. It makes you more responsible, mature. So those are the ways in which I feel rich in my upbringing and in my years of being poor. I'm no longer that, but I think they were a benefit to me.
For me, actually recognizing the wealth of Appalachian culture, which is not often associated with riches. Of course, the riches are resources that have been misappropriated, but recognizing the wealth of stories from the region was the reason why I wrote my first book of poems. Recognizing that I had a treasure trove of characters just from the life that I had lived and the people that I had met. And so exactly that, recognizing that your riches may not be the typical ones, but you do have a store of them.
And they're more substantive, and they can't be taken from you. So that's, and in the ways that the rich can be poor, I think that connects to my idea that privilege really blinds you and can make you insensitive and just prevent you from understanding what other people are going through. It doesn't happen. I mean, I'm sure they're very nice rich people. I don't know very many rich people at all. I trust they're out there. They must be very enlightened and so forth. But I think it would be hard to understand other people's suffering if you don't do it, if you haven't experienced it in some way.
Yeah, you could be poor in compassion, rich in stories, rich in character, rich in family relationships. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is excellent. Thank you all so much. Do we have any other questions, either from the audience or? Thank you all so much for this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm very grateful.
Thank you for setting it up. This is really great. Thank you.
You're welcome.